The talk, ostensibly, is about the history of the Fleet Avenue neighborhood. One of the things we have to realize, though, is that Fleet Avenue wasn't always here, and that Fleet Avenue is but a small part of a much larger city and a much larger neighborhood. Here comes my yardstick. Thanks, Matt. This is a contemporary map of the area, and what I'll be talking about roughly tonight is what was considered Old Newburgh Township, which you'll see in a few seconds. But we're talking about this area from around Turney, Miles Avenue, all the way up to Union and Ackley Avenue, East 59th Street in here. This whole district is what I'd like to encompass tonight. And I'll be talking about the history of this district basically up to the First World War, through all the changes it went through during those years, how it started out, and why it came to be the major Polish neighborhood of Cleveland. This is Old Newburgh as it appeared in the 1850s, and it gives you some idea of what grew up here. The streams here, the stream that you see here is basically what is now Morgana Park, Morgan's Run. There's another stream to the south of this that runs where, it used to be Old Pulaski Park near Harvard and 71st Street. There's a ravine back there. That was a stream there. This was all farmland. This was Newburgh. Newburgh being a part of the Connecticut Western Reserve, and it was the first section of the Connecticut Western Reserve, northeastern Ohio, to grow. There's some great stories you can tell about Cleveland and Newburgh. Cleveland was founded in 1796. It never gained any population because as soon as people moved into Cleveland, they found the swamps around it to be malarial, and they quickly packed up and moved out to what they call the Ridge Line. The Ridge Line is basically East 93rd Street. So the area around here grew quite quickly. In 1899, and this picture is much later, it received its first industry, a grist mill, founded by Mr. Williams. And the grist mill is located on Mill Creek, or was located on Mill Creek, right where Turney Road comes into Warner Road, in that section down there. If you go down Webb Terrace, you'd be seeing the site of the old grist mill. The grist mill was important for the farmers in the area. It gave them some place to grind their grain, and it then created, of course, the center for a city. And the city grew up separately from Cleveland. It was a village. It was Newburgh Village. And one of the interesting anecdotes about Newburgh Village was that in 1810, a gazetteer, which is, of course, a listing of place names, described the city of Cleveland, or the village of Cleveland, as a small settlement near Newburgh. So this was the biggest area first. Now, who came to Newburgh to begin with? Well, not Poles. The people who populated this area in the early part of the 19th century were basically Scotsmen, men from the Isle of Man, Manxmen, if you will, and a lot of people from the British Isles. It was very basically a British or an Anglo group, if you will. That changed, however, in the 1850s. In the 1850s, a number of Welshmen started coming into the area, and two of them in particular, named David and John Jones, had a trade. They were iron workers. They had learned the ironworking trade in Wales through the Industrial Revolution in Wales, and they had brought it with them to the United States, where they practiced first in Cambria, Pennsylvania, and then they came up to Cleveland. And they decided to build an iron mill in Newburgh. Well, why Newburgh? Why build it here of all places? Well, several important factors. In 1856, when the mill was started, the Sault Ste. Marie Canal was just opened, which made available iron ore from the northern slopes of Michigan. And Newburgh happened to be on the line of the Cleveland and Pittsburgh Railroad, the old Pennsylvania Railroad, which allowed for coal to be brought up from the southern coal fields, southern Ohio and the Pennsylvania coal fields. And Newburgh did have some skilled Welsh ironworkers within its confines. So they began what many people here remember as the Newburgh Works of American Steel and Wire. It was initially called the Cleveland Rolling Mills. The Jones brothers eventually went into a partnership with a fellow named Andros Stone. You may have heard of Amasa Stone, a rather famous and wealthy Clevelander. Andros was his brother. And they also went into partnership with another man, Henry Chisholm, who was a Scottish immigrant. These are some additional shots of the mills. These were taken in the 1870s. Until the 1850s, the Welshmen who were in this area provided all the labor that was really needed in the mills. What did they produce? Well, here's an advertisement for them. Basically, things for the budding railroad industry. Now, the Welsh had quite a little colony here, and one of the things that I recall when my mother bought her current house in 1965, it was bought from an old Welsh lady, one of the last remaining Welsh people in the neighborhood. They began their church, which you can see today as Jones Road Welsh Congregational Church, Jones Road being named after David and John Jones, the pioneer ironmen from Wales. They began their church actually in the 1840s. It was a wooden structure, and then in 1876 they built this structure on Jones Road. If you want to get a feel for the history of this neighborhood, I could strongly suggest you visit the inside of this church. It has not changed much since the day it was built. The original gas jets are still in the wall, and it's really a trip back over 100 years in the neighborhood. By this time, the city of Newburgh, the village of Newburgh, is beginning to prosper, 1850s, 1860s. I just show you this to give you an idea of what the Miles Park area looked like. This is the Warner Road area. Here's where the mill is. This is Mill Creek and the Falls. And the rolling mills are up in this area, not shown. Hamilton Avenue is currently Harvard, and Pittsburgh Street, which was the road to Pittsburgh, is Broadway. Now, one of the things that happened, of course, in the 1860s was the Civil War, and what the Civil War meant for mills like that of Chisholm, Jones, and Stone was increased orders and increased work. And the Welshmen could not provide the labor needed for the mills, so the Irishmen started coming into the neighborhood to provide a lot of the basic labor in the mills, and they began their own church, which we see today as Holy Name, which began life in the 1860s as Holy Rosary. The Broadway Harvard area was for a very long time very Irish. One of the stories that goes back to the beginning of this church, though, in the 1870s and 1880s, is about Father Gallagher, who was the pastor, very well known. The Gallagher building was named after him. I tell this for Tom Campbell's benefit primarily. He's heard this before. Father Gallagher found that the turnout for Sunday morning Mass was mostly female. He couldn't understand where all his male parishioners were going. So he decided on Saturday nights to tour the bars in the neighborhood, and that's where he found his male parishioners. They were spending their Saturday evenings after work in the bars. And tradition at Holy Name has it that Father Gallagher eventually started going into the bars with his shillelagh and clearing the parishioners out for worship the next morning. This is an interior of Holy Name Church taken in the 1880s. These are the mills at about the same time. They've grown considerably. And by the time this picture was taken, things were changing. There were new faces in the mills in the 1870s. And the new faces were Bohemian and they were Polish. We know that there were about 77 Poles listed in Cleveland in 1870. By 1880, there were 532 Poles listed in the census. It's an inaccurate way to count because you have to realize that there was no Polish nation at that time. So people who came to the United States ended up listing their nationality as German, Austrian, or Russian. And it's very difficult to count Poles in the census, but these are the figures we're given. And many of these Poles were beginning to come to the ironworks. The first Poles, by the way, in the greater Cleveland area settled in Berea. They worked in the sandstone quarries in Berea in the 1860s and the 1870s. Now, there are several questions that would have to be answered. Why would the Poles begin coming in the 1870s? And why, given the entire United States, would they come to Cleveland? Well, there are a number of reasons. They would start leaving Poland, particularly Prussian Poland, in the 1870s because 1871, of course, was the date of the creation of the German state. It was the date when Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, supposedly started getting things together, and it resulted in forced Germanization of many Poles, and the Poles began fleeing at that time in large numbers. And also in the 1870s and 1880s, you have increased and better transit across the oceans. Steamships, scheduled lines start operating. So there's a reason for the Poles to leave, and there's a way for them to come to the United States. But why Cleveland again? Well, I'll tell you a typical story of a Pole who arrived in the 1870s. Some of you may remember the Dluzinski family, Matthew and Theodore. They were Polish pioneers in this neighborhood. Matthew came to the United States in the 1870s when he got off the boat at Castle Garden, which was the point of disembarkation for immigrants at that time. He was told that there were jobs to be had in a city to the west named Cleveland, that they were building a large bridge there and they needed laborers. So Matthew came to Cleveland and he worked on what was the Superior Viaduct. When that job was over, he got a job as a carpenter building the Jewish Orphan Asylum on Woodland Avenue. And when the asylum was completed, he heard there were jobs to be had in the rolling mills in Newburgh, and he came here. And when Matthew Dłużyński arrived at the rolling mills in the late 1870s, he observed that there were already 50 to 60 Polish men at work in the mills. But basically, around 1880, with a workforce of 5,000 people, only about 100 workers would have been Polish, and another good number would have been Bohemian, of course, coming from what you now know as the Broadway and East 55th Street area. When the Poles first came to Cleveland and were large enough to occasion the establishment of a church, this church was turned over to them. This is known colloquially as St. Mary's of the Flats. It was Cleveland's first church, first cathedral, and it was turned over to each succeeding immigrant group as it came. And in 1873, there were enough Poles in the city of Cleveland to occasion the establishment of a parish to serve them. Not a church, but a parish, St. Stanislaus. And the parish of St. Stanislaus first met in St. Mary's. It eventually began meeting in St. Joseph's Church on Woodland Avenue. The pastoral needs of the community were tended to by Father Victor Zareczny, who was the priest at St. Adalbert's in Berea. And later, Father Wolfgang Janetz, who was a German, tended to the flock while they worshipped at St. Joseph. Matters changed greatly for this neighborhood and for Cleveland's Poles beginning in 1881. This man is Henry Chisholm. This is a statue to him, erected in Lakeview Cemetery. You can see it today. Chisholm was the immigrant part owner of the mills. He died in 1881. He was a benevolent man. His workers loved him. They put up the statue for him. I don't know if you can read the inscription, but it's erected by 6,000 employees and friends in memory of Henry Chisholm, Christian philanthropist and everybody's friend. Born Lockery, Scotland, April 27, 1822, died in Cleveland, Ohio, May 9, 1881. The most fascinating thing about this monument, and these are rather hard to see on slides, is that it is surrounded by a series of reliefs that show scenes in the rolling mills, as those first Polish immigrants would have seen them in the 1880s. You can barely see a worker here. This is a man, and the patina has stained it, but he's working in the wire mills, which was an adjunct to the rolling mills. Many people here remember the wire mills. And here are another group of workers. Well, the problem with Chisholm's death was his son William took over, and his son William was not as benevolent as the father. And in 1882, the workers at the mill, basically skilled workers who were members of a union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, came to William Chisholm and petitioned him for certain matters relating to salary and job security. Basically, as skilled workers, they were afraid that the new machinery being brought in the mills, which could be operated by unskilled workers, would put them out of a job. Well, he wouldn't listen to their demands, and they went out on strike in 1882. And for a while, the mills were simply closed down, and then Chisholm began recruiting more labor. He went to the Bohemian ward, recruited some Bohemians for labor, and then, and this is where there's a lot of tradition, he recruited some Poles to come and join the mills. He didn't do this himself. He had a foreman. I forget the man's name, but he was known as Five Tongues because he could speak 5 different languages. His foreman went out to Castle Garden in New York, and there were many Poles getting off, the boats arriving at Castle Garden, and he promised them a good, steady job in Cleveland at the rate of pay of $1.50 to $2 a day if they'd come into Cleveland. So the Poles came in. They were brought right in to the Conotton Valley Railroad Depot and literally broke the strike, although they were never aware that they were strike breakers at this time. Now, the Irish, the Welsh, and the Scots who were put out of work and who were on strike, of course, at this time looked very, should I say, badly upon the Poles coming in and doing this. Now, I guess one of the bits of tradition in this neighborhood is there's always been sort of an enmity, a little friendly rivalry between the Polish and Irish groups. It dates back to this strike in 1882. And one of the artifacts of the neighborhood that should be preserved as a trophy that used to be fought for by South High School and Holy Name. It was called the Pig Iron Trophy. And what better for the Irish of Holy Name to fight the Poles at South High for than a slab of pig iron? And it goes back to this strike in 1882. Let's see if we have any strike shots. Well, when the Poles came into Cleveland in 1882, this is what they would have found as far as a city. The city of Cleveland that ended just about here at Kingsbury Run, about what we now know as 37th Street. And out here in the background where you can see the smoke are the mills of Newburgh. Newburgh had been annexed to the city in 1874, but it was still a world apart. It was known as the Iron Ward. It was known as Newburgh. And this is what the Poles who came in at that time would have found. A lot of open land, and a lot of it owned by the original farmers. If I can find the name in here somewhere, is the name of A.W. Morgan, Ashbel W. Morgan, after whom Morgana Run is named. He was one of the major farmers here. He was the man who sold the lots to the Poles as they came into Cleveland. And now, as more Poles were in the neighborhood as a result of the strikes, by the way, the neighborhood really began to develop a little bit before the strikes as a Polish neighborhood. Fleet Avenue in 1878 got its first Polish-owned grocery store. And by the 1880s, with the people coming in for the strike, it deserved its own church. And it was at this time in 1881 that the parish of St. Stanislaus decided to build a church. They did so with the assistance of Ashbel W. Morgan, who struck a deal with the immigrants. Basically, for every immigrant who bought a house lot from Mr. Morgan, he would contribute a lot to the church. In this way, 13 lots were bought by immigrants and 13 lots were contributed to the church, which is where present St. Stanislaus today stands. So the church is located there in 1881. By the way, the immigrants originally wanted to buy some land at McBride and Broadway, where St. Alexis Hospital is. And Father Yanitz, who was servicing their needs at this time, said, well, that's much too small for a church. You better look closer to where you're working. And that's why St. Stanislaus is basically where it is today, off of East 65th or Todd Avenue at that time. Well, this is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but we'll leave it on for a while. In 1880, the Polish population of Cleveland, as I've noted, is 532. It begins growing rapidly after 1882, and this is one of the mechanisms of immigration that brings any immigrant group here. A group of people will settle, they'll be pathfinders, and then they will begin writing back to the home country saying, I have a tremendous job. I'm making more money here than I ever made before. $2 a day, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, but it was still better than the old country. And relatives would come over, and this is called a chain of migration. And this is how the neighborhood starts building up in this period. Well, the Poles worked at the mills, and because the mills were being mechanized, they were given basically unskilled jobs at the mills. Some Irish, some Scotsmen stayed on in supervisory positions. But the Poles quickly learned the ways of the Union, and they learned that they couldn't be pushed around either. And in 1885, during a slump in the steel industry, sounds familiar, doesn't it? The management of the mills, still in the unbenevolent hands of William Chisholm, decided to cut wages. They cut wages once. That was good. People stood for that. They cut them twice. The workers still stood for that. And then, I believe it was in May of 1885, Mr. Chisholm announced another cut, which, when given the original wages the workers had it ended up cutting their wages 50% altogether. At 6 p.m. on the day that he announced that, the workers, to a man, walked out of the mills and declared a strike. And they were a bit more astute in their strike than the earlier workers had been. They decided that not only were they going to close down the rolling mills and keep workers out of that, but they also knew that Mr. Chisholm's money came from other areas in Cleveland, other companies like the Union Steel, or the United States, was it Union Steel Screw Works and the HP Nail Company, which were downtown or toward the lakefront. And they marched around the city, and this is one scene of them breaking down the doors at the Steel Screw Company to force the workers out. They had gone to the HP Nail Company first and peacefully got the workers to quit work there and close the shop down. Fayette Brown, who was the manager of this work, the screw company, heard that the strikers were coming, so he barred the doors, and by the time they got there, they were in no mood to have the doors barred, so they broke them down. Well, this is a contemporary drawing of the event in 1885. These are the strikers marching through Public Square, which was known as Monument Square. They at first, before they shut anything down, went to the mayor with a petition, asked the mayor to mediate between Chisholm and themselves, and the mayor said he would, but Chisholm said he wasn't going to bargain with anyone. And these are, quote, the female operatives of the Steel Screw Company being chased by the vicious strikers. Now, this is very important in understanding this neighborhood from several viewpoints. One, it shows a sense of union and strength and unity within the people in the neighborhood. They could act as one. Two, it also shows the roots of a very strong misunderstanding that Cleveland, if you will, had of this neighborhood, or began to have as this neighborhood from the 1880s. The scenes portrayed seem very violent. They may indeed have been very violent. There was violence in the strike, but no loss of life. But from that day on, the people who read the native newspapers in Cleveland thought the Poles were troublemakers. They thought the Bohemians were troublemakers. As a matter of fact, the newspapers erroneously reported many times that the Poles and Bohemians had carried the red flag of anarchy at the head of their parade. They hadn't. But one noted anarchist had spoken at one of their rallies, and he asked them to what? Meet fire with fire, to use dynamite, the weapon of the son of toil. And then he called for the death of the Vanderbilts, the Goulds, and the Chisholms. It were things like this that got reported in the native press and colored the people's attitude toward the Poles. It was very hard for someone like Anton F. Koloszewski, the new priest at St. Stanislaus. He began in 1883 to talk to the press and say the Poles are not troublemakers. They are honest working men who have been deprived of their wages. His words tended to fall on deaf ears. People wanted to believe what they would believe. The newspapers called the strikers, both the Poles and the Bohemians, foreign devils, ignorant and degraded whelps, the canaille of Europe, vipers and communist scoundrels who have hoisted the red flag of agrarianism, nihilism, and socialism, and who revel in robberies, bloodshed, and arson. Well, that's what the neighbors to the north, if you will, saw this neighborhood. Within the neighborhood, there was still a bit of trouble. The Poles wanted honest jobs that would pay an honest wage. And yet, when they were on strike with some of the holdover Scotsmen, Welshmen, and Irishmen who were in the mills. And it was the Scotchmen, Welshmen, and Irishmen who took control of the strike committees, who governed the money, and so forth. So there was even dissension among the strikers at that time, and that's why the strike eventually did come to a failure. But one of the Poles reported he was so dissatisfied with his co-workers who were not Polish. You'll forgive the names that are mentioned here. He says, the committee gets the money. Bricky Flanagan, an Irishman, gets the whiskey, and the Polak gets nothing. And that's the way they felt to the fellow workers. Well, this was the man who stood up for the Poles at that time, Father Koloszewski. And we're going to talk about several people who've been important in the history of Fleet Avenue in this neighborhood. I can't talk about everybody. You'll forgive me if people that you've known or felt to be important are not mentioned. I have to focus on a few. Father Koloszewski came to this neighborhood in 1883 to take over St. Stanislaus Parish from Father Janets, and he's the man who built the church you know today. Father Koloszewski was more than a pastor. He was an interpreter. He struck land deals. He wrote housing contracts for Poles. He put up new immigrants in a boarding house. He put them up in his own rectory when they had no place to stay. He was advisor, counselor, and priest for the immigrant community. He was also a man of great vision, because by the mid-1880s it became apparent that this was going to be one of the largest Polish communities in the country. By this time in the 1880s, the Poles were already calling it Warszawa. And he decided a new church was in order. And these are from some of the records of St. Stanislaus, which we've preserved. This is a bid from a bell manufacturer to put in the bells at St. Stanislaus in 1887. So from 1887 until 1891, the church was building. And this is what it looked like when it was completed in 1891. And it's in the 1890s and on that the neighborhood reaches its full flower, its full maturity. It becomes literally a village within Cleveland, a Polish village within Cleveland. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. The church, this building, by the way, is the first church, the wooden church that St. Stanislaus used. It had the church, I believe, was on the first floor. His school was on the second floor. And Mr. Koloszewski, who was the first organist, was also the first teacher for St. Stanislaus. The school began almost as soon as the church. By the way, it's my understanding that this original building is cut in half and was moved across the street where it now faces. It serves as an apartment house or a residence house where it now faces the new church, which was built in 1890, completed in 1891. The story of the dedication of St. Stanislaus in 1891 is quite interesting because this neighborhood was so isolated by ravines and by distance from the city that many people had no idea of the grandiose project that was being carried on here. So the leading citizens of Cleveland, Protestant and Catholic, came out for the dedication, consecration of the church, if you will, and they were amazed. The Cleveland Plain Dealer devoted an entire page to the church and quoted, it said, confessedly, the poorest parish in the city, worst paid workers, have erected the most magnificent church in the city, indeed one of the most magnificent churches in the state. This church is, I guess, at the time of completion, I think until now, it is one of the largest Gothic churches in the state of Ohio. Some people have said it compares in size with St. Patrick's Cathedral. Not being an architect or an architectural historian, I'm not going to say that with a degree of certainty. But this is Father Koloszewski's monument. His other monument, by the way, is Sacred Heart of Jesus Parish, which was started in 1889 because the Poles were beginning to move into that area which a lot of people know as Goose Town, which was known as Krakowa, and they were originally parishioners of St. Stanislaus, except it was a long walk up from Goose Town to St. Stan's, particularly since you had a valley, a ravine, right where Ottawa Road is now and 71st Street is. So in 1889, Father Koloszewski worked with the diocese and got a new church created there. He has one more church yet to come, but that's a little later in the talk. Fine, let's take this community into the 1890s. In the 1890s, there are perhaps, I would say, 6,000 to 7,000 foreign-born Poles in the community here. They're children, they're American-born children. If you look at the number of baptisms in St. Stanislaus Church, you know the community is growing. And it's a tremendous community. So let's be a visitor to this neighborhood. Let's come in from the south. And you're coming in on the old Pennsylvania Railroad. You're coming down along what is now Broadway Avenue past Harvard. You look out the windows, and you see the shops and stores. These are basically Irish-owned at this time or Welsh-owned. See the billboards as you come in. And you get off. Now, basically where you are here, and you won't recognize it because the railroad was relocated in 1904, but this is Broadway and Harvard, past that building. And this is the Gateman's Crossing House on Harvard Avenue. And there's a station around here, and you get off. And let's say you walk up to one of the high buildings and you look behind you. Well, you look out toward Miles Park, and that's sort of the Anglo-Irish Scotch area still. But you look the other way, and this is the reason for the neighborhood. And this is how it's grown by the 1890s. These are the Cleveland rolling mills, still at that time. They became part of United States Steel after the turn of the century and became known later as the Newburgh Works, American Steel and Wire, United States Steel. This building still stands. It's one of the original railroad stations. If you would go straight in this direction from this building, you'd be on Holy Name Church. The old salvage company, Dilly Salvage, is located in front of this. Building still used by Conrail, but this is the neighborhood. It was not a place to hang your washout. Just absolutely incredible. And one of the things, too, we're so worried now about pollution. Pollution in the 1890s was a problem, but it was a sign of prosperity. And I remember there's a McKinley campaign badge that has a smoking factory chimney. It said, "Do you smoke?" And it said, "No, not until McKinley became president." So that's one of the things. There's another cute story, too, about the steel strikes in 1885. When the strikes were finally over, somebody wrote into the Cleveland Plain Dealer lamenting the fact that the strike was over. He said, "For the first time we could breathe the air in Newburgh." He said, "The trees and the plants were beginning to grow again." This is just a outline map of part. It would take 5 slides, and I want to keep you here all night to show you the entire scope of these mills. In 1920, it's estimated that 90% of the Poles in Cleveland were engaged in heavy industry, most of them at these mills. I've talked to people who've told me stories of getting up early in the morning, watching the workers come up Fleet Avenue with their lunch pails in hand, walking toward the mills. That was the whole reason for this neighborhood. Now, if we go down into Fleet Avenue in the 1890s, what do we find? Well, let's focus on some people, some personalities in the neighborhood. Let's talk about neighborhood life in the 1890s, early 1900s. This is a man whom I have christened the godfather of Warszawa, if you will, Michael P. Kniola. He was an immigrant child brought to New Jersey, raised partially in New Jersey where he learned English. Then in New Jersey he got a job in a brick factory where his English and Polish put him in good stead. He served as a foreman and an interpreter. In the late 1870s, he married a lady named Mary Skorupska, and they decided to come to Cleveland because they've heard good stories about the jobs in the mills. Mr. Kniola came to the mills, and worked in the mills for a while, and because of his bilingualism, was able to rise to foreman in the mills. He and his wife, like many other Polish immigrants, put money away, and they decided to start a business. They started a grocery store. And Mr. Kniola, in his grocery store, decided in the 1880s that he might start selling something called Schiffkarte, steamship tickets. It's a big market for it when people are bringing their relatives to Cleveland. So he starts selling steamship tickets, becomes a travel broker. He starts selling money orders so you can send money back to people. He puts a safe in the back of the building so he can act as a banker. He acts as a banker also. And he literally becomes the kingpin of the neighborhood. And if you're wondering what he looks like, this is Mr. Kniola. He's at the head of the Knights of St. Casmir, which became a group of the Alliance of Poles of America. Fraternal insurance societies were very important in this neighborhood. At first, the Polish National Alliance, the Polish Roman Catholic Union, and then the homegrown varieties like the Alliance of Poles of America and the Union of Poles of America. Why do immigrant groups like Poles need fraternal insurance societies? Very simply, they work in dangerous occupations. They need some sort of insurance at a reasonable price and a policy and a language they can understand. And you surely couldn't go to Nationwide in the 1880s and get that. You had to do it yourself. So for a quarter a week, the Alliance of Poles and other groups, whatnot, would provide you with burial insurance, insurance against injury on the job. And the rolling mills at one time acquired the name of the butcher shop because so many people were hurt or maimed or killed at the mills. And the fraternals also provided something else. They provided an outlet for people to get together, to march, to have a good time. I'm particularly fascinated by the Knights of St. Casmir, which Mr. Kniola outfitted himself. We have all of his correspondence at the Historical Society, and he must have spent the better part of a year dickering with uniform companies to make sure he got the right braids and the right uniforms. He was not a man who would take the wrong type of material. He sent it right back if he got it. Now, these are some of the posters that Kniola distributed. As a matter of fact, he kept his records on the back of these. That's why we managed to save them. This one is in German, and it's about 1914. But this is what he's dealing with. He's dealing with every major steamship company in the world. And in the 1890s and 1900s, it's big business. He's bringing over thousands of people a year. This is a list of all the ships of the Hamburg America line. If you want to see it in Polish, this is one of the advertisements that Kniola would have distributed. And he really did take care of you. If you contracted with Mike to get a relative over, he sent the money, you gave him the money, he arranged for passage. You not only got your boat passage paid for your relatives, but their rail passage to Cleveland was taken care of. As I understand, my grandparents came to this neighborhood probably through the port of Baltimore, and I would assume through Mr. Kniola's good graces. I got off the boat at Baltimore, got on the train there, and came straight into Cleveland. Now, Mr. Kniola decided to start sideline businesses. I hope you don't mind my dwelling on him, but he's a fascinating man, and he says an awful lot about how the neighborhood was growing. In addition to getting you here, Mike Kniola would, by the 1890s, early 1900s, put you up. He had a boarding house if you didn't have a place to stay. And if you didn't have a job, if you couldn't find one in the rolling mills, he was a labor broker. And he worked not only with Cleveland concerns, but with what is now Armco Steel. And let me read this for you. It's to Mr. Kniola. He said, "Yours of the 14th is received. We have finally completed the house for the men, and we would like you to send us as soon as you possibly can at least 10 good, strong, able-bodied Polish men. The 3 men that I brought with me, I fear, are not going to be of very much account. They do not seem to be able to stand the work. I do not think it possible that they could have been in this country very long and probably have not done any mill work. There's one Polish man, Sylvester Grabowski, who speaks English very well, and he's proved to be a great help to us. The 3 men that I brought with me seem disposed to return to Cleveland, and of course, if they desire to do it, they can, but I hope they will not. Hoping that you will secure the men immediately, I am sincerely yours. We have other letters from the same man saying that he prefers Poles to Romanians. It was all a matter of which immigrants you wanted to use. And it's very, very interesting on how this is handled. There was a commission paid for successful work in getting laborers into the mills. You have to understand that the rolling mills here not only went on strike in 1882 and 1885, but they went on strike in the 1890s, and business was up and down, and people were constantly in and out of work. There's no job security whatsoever in the neighborhood. Now, if we talk about other personalities in the neighborhood, and I bring this man up, this is Telesfor Olsztynski, who was Kniola's counterpart. I neglected to mention that one of the things Kniola got into was politics. See, one of the things that Mike had was a lot of connections in Warszawa. And suddenly when the native politicians said, my God, out in the 18th Ward, there are a lot of votes that we can get. I wonder how we can get them. They got in with Kniola, and Kniola delivered votes. He was a Republican. A lot of people don't realize it, but the Republicans were the first party to make inroads into Southern Eastern European immigrant communities. And they started doing this in the 1890s. And Kniola did their work for them. He worked with the senator, Theodore Burton. Burton gave him tips on land to buy. Kniola worked for getting the votes out, and he was an ardent Republican. He had dinner with President McKinley several times in recognition of the work that he had done. Olsztynski also was a Republican at that time, and he ran something called the Olsztyn Carriage Works. Now, there's a story that comes from a family. I don't know if it's Olsztynski's or not. This gives you another reason for immigration. I have to tell you, it's a rather cute anecdote, and it should get away from a rather, I should say, formal atmosphere here. We've always heard of immigrants coming to the country for jobs, to escape political repression. A lot of immigrants came to escape conscription into the army. I mean, no Pole wants to fight in the German army, and that was a main reason for coming for many of them. One family, I understand, there were several young Poles who were out on the town in Poland, in Prussian Poland, in the 1880s, and had spent the night at the local tavern and gotten rather well lubricated, if you will, and went out after that and needed, forgive me, a place to relieve themselves, and they found the local Prussian military statue, and they decided that that was the appropriate spot. The next morning they woke up, realized what they had done, and decided to go to America. So for every esoteric reason you have for people coming to America, there's something like that. There's a family tradition that my grandfather used to steal potatoes, and I assume maybe that's why he came here. I don't know. Well, let's look around the neighborhood this way. I told you they're all good Republicans. This was a collage of 100 Polish businessmen and businesswomen, if you will. You'll notice a lot of women in here who ran businesses. That was put together in 1896 by, guess who? Michael Kniola. But it was one to wish in memory of the 100th anniversary of the founding of the city of Cleveland. That's Cleveland's 100th anniversary, 1896. And good luck, Bill McKinley, you're running for president this year. So you got everything on it. You got your ads on the end. Dr. Peter Schmiegel, who was the first Polish physician, is listed here. Tons of things. I think I have a closer shot here. Let's see. Now here are some of the names. Here's our friend Mike. This one is always a mystery to me because this is a picture pasted over someone else's picture. And I suspect the original man may have voted Democrat. I don't know. But this is one of the ways, this picture, to really get an idea of the diversity of businesses in this neighborhood. I'm old enough to remember a grocery store on every corner. When we're talking about this neighborhood in the 1890s, we were talking about 40, 50 grocery stores and just as many saloons, really. And you can't look at saloons in a pejorative or bad way, because after 10 hours in the mill 6 days a week, you had to go someplace. And the saloon was a place where you could be convivial, talk, discuss the affairs of the day and whatnot. It replaced what had been the village tavern in the old country. It is a direct descendant of that. One of the ways that we've been able to measure the growth of the Polish community in Cleveland is to chart the ownership of businesses. And you work with things that pervade the necessities of life, groceries, butcher shops, saloons, if you will. And you can see where they're located, and you know where the neighborhood goes from seeing that. And this neighborhood was full of them. By this time, in the 1890s, the neighborhood has a newspaper. This is Polonia of Medici. It's the first Polish language paper published in Cleveland. This is a 1906 issue. The paper was started in 1892. The names of the founders are very familiar. The Dluzinski brothers, Mike Kniola, Telesfor Olsztyński, all the businessmen got together. There was a need for a paper by this time. America Echo out of Toledo used to send issues here before that, but this is the first newspaper. And from this day, 1892 till the present, there have been Polish newspapers. In 1965, the last daily, the Wiadomości Codzienne, the Polish Daily News, closed shop. And if you look in the various papers, you can see the ads for the businesses. This is Jan Malinowski's saloon, but he also sells steamship tickets. What's the rule among cartels and conglomerates now, that diversity is the best way to escape recession? And you can look here, we're already selling. The symbols of Pulaski and Kosciuszko, by the way, were not invented for the bicentennial, as many people would tend to think. The Poles revered them all the way through their history. You see the three of them. And Mr. Zalkowski is selling cigars. Cigars seem to be a real big seller in the neighborhood. Kniola, after he started his steamship business, decided to close out the groceries, but he kept selling cigars and snuff. And we have his invoices for cigars and snuff, and there was enough tobacco going through on Todd Street to buy, just unbelievable. And then Schlezak, the first undertaker in the neighborhood was Schlezak brothers. It's an interesting story here. Do you know how the Schlezaks became undertakers? Well, when the Poles first settled here in the 1870s, they had no undertakers, so they had to go to Mr. Wolf, who was a Bohemian. It served the Czech neighborhood. And Mr. Wolf took care of the Polish burials. And then Wolf's daughter married a Schlezak. They married into the business, and it continued from that day. And what else was going on? Well, the Stars and Stripes Mandolin Club, which you've probably never heard of, I never did, was having a concert in the Pulaski Hall on Chambers Avenue. Now, the prices are a lot cheaper then. Of course, then when you're making $20 a week at the most in the mills, so you have to wonder. But, you know, we're talking about men like Kniola and Olston and so forth. You have to wonder, what's the rest of the neighborhood doing? What's the common man doing? Well, this is, let's say, the 1890s, or let's say 1900. This is Osmond Court, which is around the corner from here. It's off of Todd Street, 65th Street. This is Morgana Run before there's a softball field there. And there are a series of houses. Now, the next slide I'm going to show you is not too clear, but it's going to show you who lived in these houses and what they did. This is a page from the Federal Census of 1900. I had to shoot this off of a microfilm reader, and it's really difficult. But when you look at the place of birth, you can see where the elders are born. Place of birth, let's see. Poland, Russian Poland, Prussian Poland, 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 Ohio. These are the children. Poland, Poland, Ohio, Ohio, Poland, Poland. Polish-born with American-born children. What were their occupations? Laborer, steel mill. Laborer, steel mill. Laborer, rod mill. Occupation at home, that's the wife. Laborer, steel mill. At home, at home. Cutter, wire mill. Furnace in the wire mill. Wire drawer at the wire mill. At school, at school, at school, at school, at school, and it's got to be St. Stanislaus, wouldn't be any place else at that time, and labor at the rod mill. There's one person I hear who was a tailor's apprentice, and that's it. As I said, it was estimated in 1920, when we're talking about 30,000 foreign-born Poles in Cleveland, that 90% of them were engaged in heavy work. The amazing thing about this, and there's a quote, and you have to forgive the way in which this is written, because this is written by the first sociologist, if you will, who looked at the Poles in Cleveland and wrote a history of them. And I should read this to you. This is they're workers. The Polish people are workers. It has been said that the Pole does not care for an 8-hour day. He would rather work a 6-hour day with 6 hours overtime. This is remarkable in view of the exhausting physical labor in which more than 90% of these people are engaged. The mold was broken, and it broke in the 20s and 30s, but when you looked at Warsaw, in the 1890s and you got up early and you looked out the window, you saw the men going to work with their lunch buckets at the wire mills or at the rolling mills. The census is fascinating. We've just received the 1900 census at the Historical Society. We'll be getting the 1910 one for us. By the way, one of these people here is named Grabowski. He happens to be my grandfather. You'll forgive me for throwing this on the screen. Now, the neighborhood, there were jobs when the mills were working. There were places to go. There was a church that was the focal point of the neighborhood. But the neighborhood had problems. And one of the reasons I'm talking tonight, I think, is to indicate the diversity of a neighborhood, how a neighborhood changes, and that people can't look at the Poles in Warszawa and say, well, they're all the same. They're always happy. They've always gotten along together. There are splits. And one of the splits centered about this man. This is Father Koloszewski. And the cartoon is from Yelchenka, which was a pro-Koloszewski paper in 1893. And this is a picture up above the cartoon. This is Warszawa as Father Koloszewski found it. This is Warszawa as Father Koloszewski left it. Now left it, I didn't tell you he left it. He was forced out because St. Stanislaus Church split into two factions in 1891. The story of this is just being researched and written by Henry Leonard at Kent State. But apparently there were some problems with the church debt. There were some problems with Father Koloszewski's attitude toward the diocese, supposedly. And he was forced out in 1892 by Bishop Horstmann, a German who did not have a great fondness for ethnic parishes, Polish or otherwise. And Koloszewski was told to go to Syracuse, New York, which he did, and the church was given over to Father Roginski at that time. Well, there were a lot of people in the neighborhood who loved Koloszewski, and they asked him to come back. And he did come back in 1894 against the orders of the bishop, and he established Immaculate Heart of Mary Church, which you all know is on Lansing Avenue. This is a closer picture of that. I'll leave this on for a while. He established this church against the orders of the bishop. The bishop then proceeded to tell Koloszewski and his followers that if they did not basically cease and desist, that they would all be excommunicated, which they did. There was a non-diocesan church. It was an independent Polish Catholic parish. What is the Union of Poles had its beginnings as a fraternal insurance organization for that parish, I believe, as the Polish Catholic Union of Our Lady of Częstochowa, and it stayed as an independent parish until 1909 when it was brought back into the community. Now this may seem like no great problem to us sitting here today, but if you talk to older people in this neighborhood, you'll realize that it was a tremendous problem. I've talked to people who have told me stories that the pro and anti-Immaculate Heart of Mary factions would line up on the streets during a funeral. And let's say the funeral was for a person at Immaculate Heart of Mary, and they were taking them down Independence Road to the cemetery. The St. Stan's faction would shout traitors at them, and the Immaculate Heart people would shout back Romans at the St. Stan's people. And it was basically a feeling on the part of the Immaculate Heart people that the diocese, that the Germans and the Irish had too much to say about how the Poles were running their church. Anyway, that wound eventually was healed over when the church was brought back. I shouldn't say healed over, because one of the things about my family was I was brought up at Immaculate Heart of Mary Church. I thought that the family had always gone there. And lo and behold, I find all the family records at St. Stanislaus, and when talking to family members, find out that we were ardent pro-St. Stanislaus people until 1909 when Immaculate Heart was brought in, and the diocese arbitrarily divided the neighborhood and said, well, you're going to Immaculate Heart, and you're going to St. Stanislaus. And I guess my grandparents went to Immaculate Heart kicking and screaming because that was the last place they wanted to go. But that's Father Koloszewski's third church. The other problem in this neighborhood, and again, it's something you do have to face up with, is this man. His name is Leon Sholgus. If you read the article in the newspaper, we spelled his name wrong. It's C-Z, not S-Z-O-L, G-O-S-Z. It's in the 1880s and 1890s that the neighborhood's just getting over the bad troubles of the rolling mill strikes. And in 1901, this man, who had lived in Cleveland since 1890, went to Buffalo, New York, and shot President William McKinley. And suddenly, Cleveland has a newsmaker. And where does he come from but the Polish neighborhood? And again, all of the prejudice and bad feeling of the community against the Poles, well, they were anarchists and troublemakers in 1885, and this man says he's an anarchist, and that's why he shot the president, is given up again toward the neighborhood. This is the family home on Fleet Street. The Sholgushes originally bought a saloon and a meeting hall at what is now Gertrude and East 65th Street. And it was there that young Leon listened to a socialist group meet, the Scylla Socialist Club, and supposedly became a radical. If you look into his real history, though, he is anything but a radical. I say that if any of our presidential assassins should be labeled as insane or mentally unbalanced, it's Mr. Sholgus. But his name has almost been lost to history except for those people who remember the bitter feeling that was occasioned in this neighborhood. One of the fascinating aspects for me, one of the reasons I became interested in the neighborhood, was learning about this man and wondering how the neighborhood that I'd grown up in, which had flags out on the 4th of July and was very patriotic, how something like this could have happened. And it's one of the fascinating aspects of going back into neighborhood history. The other fascinating aspect about this is that when the native newspapers wanted to get the story on Mr. Sholgus, they sent their reporters out to the neighborhood, but nobody would speak English. So they had to go to the German paper, the Vector and Anzeiger, and find a reporter there who spoke Polish and English. They came into the neighborhood in 1901 with an interpreter. That's how much of a closed, insular village this was in 1901. But its insularity, its village nature, was beginning to be broken down by 1902. In 1902, this man, Joseph Sledge, whose saloon is now Lemon's Cafe, was elected as the first Polish councilman from Ward 18. Until this time, the Irishmen had managed to buy the Polish votes. And beginning in 1902 until the present, the ward has always been represented by a Pole. With one occasion, I hate to tell you this, in 1927, an Irishman named John McCreel slipped through when a old Immaculate Heart of Maryite ran against a St. Stanislaus person, and the Poles split their votes, and the Irish sneaked through in the gap. See, Tom, that's the only way you'll ever get in. And that conflict is over, so you might as well forget it. But Sledge became the first councilman, and when you get councilmen from the neighborhood, things begin to happen. The streets, which were all mud, began to be paved. A family named Orlikowski does a lot of the paving. If you wonder why the Orlikowski house is big in brick, it's because he was a paving contractor for many of the streets. Sledge's greatest accomplishment in 1905 is getting the city to pay for a bridge to go across Morgana Run. So you can go down East 65th Street straight to Broadway. You don't have to go down the hill and crawl up the other side of the hill to get to Broadway. This helps connect Warszawa with the city. And it's beginning at this time that the city starts growing around Warszawa, and Warszawa becomes part of the city. Native politicians. Harry L. Davis runs for mayor. He's going to have a meeting, and there are going to be speeches in both English and Polish. And the other thing that's happening at this time, turn of the century, the first people born here are coming of age. They're voters. They're increasing the population. The neighborhood is growing. If you look at the census in 1910, it doesn't give you a figure. If you look at it in 1920, for instance, you see 35,000 Polish-born people in Cleveland, most of them in this neighborhood. You have to imagine how many of their sons and daughters are also here, American-born, who are not in this 35,000 figure. And the neighborhood is growing. We'll take a look at some pictures here around Broadway and Harvard. This is 1905. This is a hearse. I would like to believe it's a Schlezak hearse coming back from Calvary Cemetery. And you can see the streets are getting paved. I could have shown you a picture of this corner, although it's not strictly Polish. I could have shown you a picture of this 10 years before, and it was mud. Same corner looking up Harvard. I always remember this little building where you could buy racing forms. That's an old passenger train up at the Newburgh stop. This is later, this is 1909. They're digging under for the short line railroad, and you're looking down toward Holy Name, toward the mills. You can still see the smoke in the background. And this is a little bit later. This is 1913. So we've taken the neighborhood rather rapidly up to about the time of the First World War. What's happening within the neighborhood? I mean, we're seeing the corner of Broadway and Harvard. Well, in 1906, the Franciscans are asked to manage the affairs of St. Stanislaus Church. They began there. Many people remember Father Kolomaya as one of the first people there, who I believe served 3 times at St. Stanislaus. And it's under the Franciscans that the new school building is built in 1906. It's one of the important things about any immigrant group. The church is always attached, or school is always attached to the church. And most of the courses would be taught in Polish. It's only after World War I, with pressure to Americanize, when that pressure comes on, that the course load in English becomes greater. Of course, in 1909, St. Stanislaus changes. There was a tremendous windstorm, and this is when St. Stanislaus lost its spires. There was one person killed at that time, a young person from his first communion, I believe. It just made his first communion. A little girl. Yeah, okay. 1909. I've often wished that one of the best, that we should rebuild the spires. But this is one of the pictures. Neighborhood's changing. The church is still the focal point of the neighborhood.
That's my father.
It is? You'll have to see me afterwards. This is an unidentified picture at our files from St. Stanislaus.
My grandmother has your name, and my grandmother has your name.
Very good. And the neighborhood is changing. Why pay rent when you can buy a lot for $200? Right? Now, two things to remember here. You have a neighborhood that's becoming part of the city, and it's becoming very strongly Polish. But the neighborhood starts moving away, beginning at this time. This is 1914. And where are the lots? Corlett. And as early as 1914, there are enough Poles out at Corlett, at Harvard and 131st Street, to create Our Lady of Czestochowa Church to serve them. And these are Poles who work here, but they can't stand the smoke either. And now there's a streetcar line out to Corlett. And for $200, they're going to buy a lot. And that's what happens. It begins then. And later, in the 20s, the movement to Garfield Heights begins out of the neighborhood, again along the streetcar line. I think this is absolutely great. Right? $10 payments, right? That's about how much I pay on my principal on my mortgage now. But the neighborhood does change. Other things are changing too. This is a later picture, but one of the things when we talk about women's history and such, the men's fraternals did not admit women to membership in the 1920s. So new organizations are being formed. The Harmonia Chopin Singing Society is formed at this time. And the very important thing about Harmonia Chopin is that it does not only give concerts in this neighborhood for the Poles, but it goes out to the general community. And suddenly around 1905 to 1914, Clevelanders are hearing more about Polish culture, about the Polish community from groups like the Harmonia Chopin. There is a connection, both physical and cultural, that's beginning at this time. The most important thing for the Poles in the eyes of Cleveland is this. The real chance to recreate the Polish state came in 1914 with the outbreak of the First World War. That does two things. One, it stops immigration to Cleveland almost dead. And it also gives the Poles a chance to bargain for the recreation of the homeland. There are two schools of thoughts among Cleveland Poles. One group follows a fellow named Pilsudski, who advocates going along with the Germans because the Germans have said to the Poles, if you fight for us, we'll create an independent Polish state with a German prince as its king for you after the war if you fight the Russians and the French with us. And after the Russians drop out of the conflict in 1917, the Allies say to the Poles, well, the heck with the Germans, we'll give you a whole new Polish state if you fight for us. And so before the United States even enters the conflict, this is in front of the Sokol Polski Hall, a group of people get together to recruit a Polish volunteer army to fight in France with the Allies.